Hello there, you are welcome to HisGov TV, and my name is Collins Nanaya Abebese. Now, in this video, I'm going to show you a particular documentary that I have put together about the sad story of tɔma Sankara, who happens to be a revolutionary and a Pan-Africanist. Somebody who stood for Africa and ideals of Africa. And this particular story is very sad because it is a story full of betrayal, full of all kinds of things. You can imagine the story between tɔma Sankara and Blaise Compaoré, and it's just one of the most saddest story ever told in the history of Africa. It's almost like that of Congo when Mobutu overthrew Lumumba. It's almost the same thing, Blaise Compaoré murdering tɔma Sankara, such an upright man, so it's just so sad. But let's watch the video about this young president who died at a very, very youthful age. And then when we come back, we can react to this. Share your view in the comment section. Do not forget to subscribe.
Thomas Sankara was unique among late 20th century presidents in Africa and beyond. His political leadership was guided by a pro-people militant activism that brought together strands of radical anti-imperial Pan-Africanism, Marxist-Leninism, feminism, agro-ecological approaches to food justice, and more. Through his electrifying public speeches, his militant activism materialized as one grounded in the urgent and ongoing need for concrete decolonization. For Sankara, women and the rural poor were unavoidably at the forefront of liberation projects. In this video, we shall examine the life of Thomas Sankara, highlighting on his achievements. Thomas Sankara was born Thomas Isidore Noël Sankara on the 21st of December 1949 in Yako, French Upper Volta, as the third of 10 children to Joseph and Marguerite Sankara. His father, Joseph Sankara, a gendarme, was of mixed Mossi Fulani heritage, while his mother, Marguerite Kaïa, was of direct Mossi descent. He spent his early years in kaʁa, a town in the humid southwest to which his father was transferred as an auxiliary gendarme. As the son of one of the few African functionaries then employed by the colonial state, he enjoyed a relatively privileged position. The family lived in a brick house with the families of other gendarmes at the top of a hill overlooking the rest of kaʁa. His Roman Catholic parents wanted him to become a priest, but he chose to enter the military. The military was popular at the time, having just ousted a despised president. It was also seen by young intellectuals as a national institution that might potentially help to discipline the inefficient and corrupt bureaucracy, counterbalance the inordinate influence of traditional chiefs, and generally help modernize the country. Besides, acceptance into the military academy would come with a scholarship. Sankara could not easily afford the costs of further education otherwise. He took the entrance exam and passed. After basic military training in secondary school in 1966, Sankara began his military career at the age of 19 and a year later was sent to Madagascar for officer training at Ansarabe, where he witnessed popular uprisings in 1971 and 1972 against the government of Philibert Tsiranana. He read the works of Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin, profoundly influencing his political views for the rest of his life. Returning to Upper Volta in 1972, he fought in a border war between Upper Volta and Mali by 1974. He earned fame for his performance in the conflict, but years later would renounce the fighting as useless and unjust, a reflection of his growing political consciousness. He also became a popular figure in the capital of Ouagadougou. Sankara was a decent guitarist. He played in a band named Tout et Coup Jazz and rode a bicycle. Sankara was appointed Minister of Information in Say Zerbo's military government in September 1981. Sankara differentiated himself from other government officials in many ways, such as biking to work every day, instead of driving in a car. While his predecessors would censor journalists and newspapers, Sankara encouraged investigative journalism and allowed the media to print whatever it found. This led to publications of government scandals by both privately owned and state-owned newspapers. He resigned on the 12th of April 1982 in opposition to what he saw as the regime's anti-labor drift, declaring misfortune to those who gag the people. After another coup brought to power Major Dr. Jean-Baptiste Ouédraogo, Sankara became prime minister in January 1983, but he was dismissed on May 17. In between those 4 months, Sankara pushed Ouédraogo's regime for more progressive reforms. Sankara was then arrested and placed under house arrest. The decision to arrest Sankara proved to be very unpopular with the younger officers in the military regime, and his imprisonment created enough momentum for his friend Blaise Compaoré to lead another coup. A coup was organized by Blaise Compaoré made Sankara president on the 4th of August 1983 at the age of 33. The coup was supported by Libya, which was at the time on the verge of war with France in Chad. Sankara saw himself as a revolutionary and was inspired by the examples of Cuba's Fidel Castro and Che Guevara and Ghana's military leader Jerry Rawlings. As president, he promoted the democratic and popular revolution. The ideology of the revolution was defined by Sankara as anti-imperialist in a speech on the 2nd of October 1983. His policy was oriented toward fighting corruption and promoting reforestation. On the 4th of August 1984, the first anniversary of his accession, he renamed the country Burkina Faso, meaning, the land of upright people, in Maure and Diala, the 2 major languages of the country. He also gave it a new flag and wrote a new national anthem. Sankara's first priorities after taking office were feeding, housing and giving medical care to his people who desperately needed it. Sankara launched a mass vaccination program in an attempt to eradicate polio, meningitis and measles. From 1983 to 1985, 2 million Burkinabè were vaccinated. Prior to Sankara's presidency, infant mortality in Burkina Faso was about 20.8%. During his presidency it fell to 14.5%. Sankara's administration was also the first African government to publicly recognize the AIDS epidemic as a major threat to Africa. Improving women's status in Burkinabè society was one of Sankara's explicit goals, and his government included a large number of women, an unprecedented policy priority in West Africa. His government banned female genital mutilation, forced marriages and polygamy, while appointing women to high governmental positions and encouraging them to work outside the home and stay in school even if pregnant. Sankara also promoted contraception and encouraged husbands to go to market and prepare meals to experience for themselves the conditions faced by women. Denouncing the support of the United States to Israel and South Africa, he called on African countries to boycott the 1984 Summer Olympics in Los Angeles. At the United Nations General Assembly, he also denounced the invasion of Grenada by the United States, which responded by implementing trade sanctions against Burkina Faso. While he had good relations with Ghanaian leader Jerry Rawlings and Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi, he was relatively isolated in West Africa. Leaders close to France, such as Houphouët Boigny in Côte d'Ivoire and Hassan II in Morocco, were particularly hostile to him. He sold off the government fleet of Mercedes cars and made the Renault 5, the cheapest car sold in Burkina Faso at that time, the official service car of the ministers. He reduced the salaries of well-off public servants, including his own, and forbade the use of government chauffeurs and first-class airline tickets. He opposed foreign aid, saying that, "He who feeds you, controls you." He spoke in forums like the Organization of African Unity against what he described as neo-colonialist penetration of Africa through Western trade and finance. He called for a united front of African nations to repudiate their foreign debt. He argued that the poor and exploited did not have an obligation to repay money to the rich and exploiting.
Qui ici ne souhaite pas que la dette soit purement et simplement effacée? Celui qui ne le souhaite pas, il peut sortir, prendre son avion et aller tout de suite à la Banque mondiale payer.
He refused to use the air conditioning in his office on the grounds that such luxury was not available to anyone but a handful of Burkinabès. As president, he lowered his salary to $450 a month and limited his possessions to a car, 4 bikes, 3 guitars, a refrigerator, and a broken freezer. On the 15th of October 1987, Sankara was killed by an armed group with 12 other officials in a coup d'état organized by his former colleague Blaise Compaoré. When accounting for his overthrow, Compaoré stated that Sankara jeopardized foreign relations with former colonial power France and neighboring Ivory Coast, and accused his former comrade of plotting to assassinate opponents. After the coup, and although Sankara was known to be dead, some CDRs mounted an armed resistance to the army for several days. According to Haruna Traoré, the sole survivor of Sankara's assassination, Sankara was attending a meeting with the Conseil de l'Entente. His assassins singled out Sankara and executed him. The assassins then shot at those attending the meeting, killing 12 other people. Sankara's body was riddled with bullets to the back, and he was quickly buried in an unmarked grave while his widow Mariam and 2 children fled the nation. Compaoré immediately reversed the nationalizations, overturned nearly all of Sankara's policies, rejoined the International Monetary Fund and World Bank to bring in, desperately needed, funds to restore the shattered economy, and ultimately spurned most of Sankara's legacy. Compaoré's dictatorship remained in power for 27 years until it was overthrown by popular protests in 2014. In 2017, the Burkina Faso government officially asked the French government to release military documents on the killing of Sankara after his widow accused France of masterminding his assassination. In April 2021, 34 years after Sankara's assassination, former President Compaoré and 13 others were indicted for complicity in the murder of Sankara as well as other crimes in the coup. This development came as part of President Roch Kaboré's framework of national reconciliation. In October 2021, the trial against Compaoré and 13 others began in Ouagadougou, with Compaoré being tried in absentia. Ex-presidential security chief Hyacinth Kafondo was also tried in absentia. A week before the trial, Compaoré's lawyers stated that he wouldn't be attending the trial, which they characterized as having defects, and also emphasized his privilege for immunity. On the 6th of April 2022, Compaoré and 2 others were found guilty and sentenced to life in prison in absentia. 8 others were sentenced to between 3 and 20 years in prison. 3 were found innocent. The exhumation of what are believed to be the remains of Sankara started on African Liberation Day, the 25th of May 2015. Permission for an exhumation was denied during the rule of his successor, Blaise Compaoré. The exhumation would allow the family to formally identify the remains, a long-standing demand of his family and supporters.
So yeah, that is the story of Thomas Sankara. Very, very sad story. And you know, Blaise Compaoré is still in the hiding. And even though today the people, the upright people in Burkina Faso have spoken, I think that you know, of course, justice will finally prevail. But you know, one thing that I'm also concerned about is the West influence in African politics. You see, because Thomas Sankara was an anti-French, you saw how quickly he was taken out. Blaise Compaoré, who was you know, always in support of the French, you saw how the French has kept him. And I'm sure, had it not been the revolution or the uprising in Burkina Faso, I am sure that Blaise Compaoré, of course, Blaise Compaoré would still be in office. You know, it takes the people to speak. You know, if not, I'm sure that the French would still have kept Blaise Compaoré in office. And that is, of course, something that I always find worrying about the African political scene. You know, and of course, Thomas Sankara did a lot. You know, the same thing, of course, happened in Côte d'Ivoire between Laurent Gbagbo and then, of course, Ouattara. You know, and it's just It's just for something else. I think it's time the West left Africans to live their life. Leave Africans to just be themselves. I mean, we've had enough. We've had enough about this colonialism colonialism and all of that. We've had enough. I think it is time that the West left Africans to of course have their own way. It's just too much. It's just too much to take away the life of such a young man, energetic man who only, of course, was to help his people. And then, of course, one thing I like about him was his non-materialistic nature, that we should all, be in this car because that will save the country. I don't think many leaders today do that, and I think that a lot of leaders should also learn that from him, that when times are hard, our government should cut expenditures, as in the case of Ghana, my country, whereby we've had an inflation over 150%. Almost everything has been increased, not less than 100%, just within 8 months or so, and still government is not willing to cut down the size of his government. He's not willing to cut down for government expenditure. They are still spending, and the people are suffering. But I think that if African leaders are to emulate tɔma Sankara, I believe that a lot would of course happen for the country. I don't know your view on tɔma Sankara. You can share that in the comment section for us. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more of this educative content.